There are people who believe you can measure a human being's worth by their clothes, by the way they speak, by the place they come from. That wealth must be visible before it even exists, and that anyone who doesn't fit the mold deserves suspicion, mockery, or humiliation. Maybe you felt this on your own skin, or maybe you've seen it happen to someone close to you. That bitter feeling of being judged before you even open your mouth. What's most frightening is that prejudice often doesn't come shouting. It comes smiling, disguised as a rule, a joke, or "I'm just doing my job," until the day it crosses the line, until the day the truth decides to show up, and no one is ready to hear it. This is the story of a simple man, treated as less than he truly was. A story of mockery, humiliation, and imposed silence, but also of courage, identity, and a kind of wealth that time cannot take away. And perhaps, somewhere along the way, you'll realize that those who seem small are not always weak, and that some truths, when they finally surface, have the power to silence an entire room. Jose Batista pushed the bank's revolving door with slight effort, still feeling the dry earth clinging to his boots. The smell of dust mixed with the sweat of a long day clashed with the artificial scent of the air conditioning. The moment he stepped inside, the murmur softened. It wasn't silence out of respect. It was that uneasy quiet of people who stare too closely. Before saying a single word, he was already being assessed. The light-colored floor exposed every muddy footprint he left behind. Some customers looked away. Others stared without bothering to hide it. Someone let out a low chuckle, the kind steeped in mockery. Jose felt his stomach tighten, but kept moving forward. It wasn't the first time he'd faced judgment, yet it always hurt in a different way. Across the hall, Eduardo Ribeiro watched everything with a crooked smile at the corner of his mouth. Impeccable suit, tie perfectly in place, the posture of someone who believed himself beyond question. To him, Jose didn't look like a customer. He looked like a problem. One that didn't belong among marble, glass, and fake elegance. Eduardo stepped out from behind the counter without haste, making sure to draw attention. Each step echoed as if announcing authority. He stopped right in front of Jose and scanned him from head to toe. The dirty boots, the simple shirt, the worn hat. Prejudice didn't need words, but he chose to use them anyway. "Do you know this is a bank, right?" he said, his tones sharp, dripping with sarcasm. A few people laughed, others pretended to scroll through their phones. Jose took a deep breath, swallowed hard. The humiliation came hot and direct, without asking permission. Jose answered politely, the way he'd been taught from an early age. He said he only wanted to withdraw some money, nothing special. Eduardo let out a soft laugh, crossed his arms, and made a remark about customer profile. He spoke of wealth as if it were something you wore, not something you built. That stung more than Jose cared to admit. The laughter spread through the room, one here, another there. Mockery became collective. Jose felt his face burn, yet he held his ground. The humiliation was heavy, but giving up would have been worse. He stood firm, the same way he did when the land cracked under drought and still had to be planted. Eduardo leaned on the counter, now clearly enjoying the scene. He spoke loudly as if standing on a stage. He joked about account balances, about unpleasant surprises, drawing even more laughter. Jose clenched his hat between his fingers. The moment carried the bitter taste of old injustices. Jose tried to explain that he was a long-time customer, that he'd had an account there for many years. He spoke calmly, never raising his voice. Eduardo interrupted, pulled faces, feigned impatience. It was as if he had already decided who Jose was without hearing a single full sentence, prejudice disguised as policy. Someone remarked, loud enough for everyone to hear, something about a country millionaire. The laughter came thick and heavy. Jose closed his eyes for a brief moment. He knew what he had built, he knew his own worth, but there inside that bank, none of it seemed to matter. Only appearances did. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, satisfied, like someone fully in control. He suggested Jose come back another day, better dressed. He said it with a false politeness, the kind that cuts deeper than open rudeness. Jose felt a knot form in his throat as old memories came rushing back. The room felt even colder, or maybe it was just the sensation of being alone among so many people. Jose noticed a few phones raised, recordings beginning. The humiliation was no longer just his, it was becoming a spectacle. Eduardo took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. His smile belonged to someone absolutely certain he was on top. To him, that simple man could never prove otherwise. Prejudice fed of that blind confidence. Jose adjusted his hat on his head, a gesture that reminded him of his father. It wasn't submission, it was dignity. He looked around, taking in every face, every laugh, every sideways glance. That moment would not be forgotten anytime soon. Something inside him was beginning to shift. Eduardo leaned forward once more, ready to throw out a challenge disguised as a joke. The room grew strange, too quiet for a few seconds. Jose's heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. That mockery was about to cross a line, and no one there had any idea what was coming next. Eduardo Ribeiro placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward, like someone preparing to put on a show. His gaze swept across the room, searching for an audience. Jose Batista immediately realized this was no longer customer service. It was a performance. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost suffocating. Something serious was about to happen. With a smile full of mockery, Eduardo spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He said that bank wasn't a place for jokes or for country adventures. He talked about money as if it were far too rare to end up in the hands of someone like Jose. The humiliation grew thicker, more direct, and the curious stares only multiplied. Once again, Jose calmly asked to withdraw his money. He didn't raise his voice or lose his respect. He just wanted to take care of what he had come there to do. Eduardo laughed, shook his head, and said that was hard to believe. The word millionaire came out of his mouth like a joke. That was when Eduardo made the bet. He spoke as if it were something funny, almost a favor. He said that if Jose really had the balance, he would pay double the amount requested. But if he didn't, Jose would never set foot in that bank again. A heavy silence fell. The humiliation took on an official shape. Some customers laughed out loud, others exchanged curious glances. Some even found it entertaining. Jose felt his chest tighten. That bet wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. The mockery laid bare the prejudice that had always been there, hidden behind the counter. Eduardo crossed his arms, confident. He said it was just a joke, but his tone told a different story. He was absolutely certain Jose didn't have a single cent. To him, wealth didn't match dirty boots. The humiliation was guaranteed, at least in his mind. Jose remained silent for a few seconds. He looked at his own hands, marked by sun and hard work. He thought about how many times he had been underestimated in life. That bet stirred all of it up. It wasn't easy to swallow, but backing down wasn't an option either. He felt everyone's eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. Jose thought about leaving, about avoiding further humiliation, but something inside him said this had to be faced. Eduardo let out a short, impatient chuckle. He said Jose was taking too long, commented that it was becoming awkward. Pure irony. Prejudice wore a suit and tie and still considered itself polite. Jose slowly lifted his head. His gaze wasn't of defiance, but of resolve. He said he accepted the bet. The words came out simply, without drama, yet they caused an immediate stir. Mockery turned into surprise. Eduardo's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly covered it with an even bigger smile. He thought it would only make things more entertaining. He remarked that he was doing Jose a favor, giving him a chance. Humiliation continued to be treated as a joke. One customer pulled out a phone, then another. The bet was already being recorded. Jose noticed but didn't ask them to stop. If it was going to become a spectacle, let it be one of truth. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Eduardo asked Jose to properly identify himself, his tone thick with suspicion. He spoke about possible fraud, about common scams. Every word pushed Jose further into the role of a suspect. Prejudice was now taking the shape of accusation. Jose handed over his documents with a steady hand. Inside, the tension was intense. He knew who he was, he knew what he had, but he also knew that wasn't always enough when appearances spoke louder. The humiliation wasn't over yet. Eduardo took his papers and made a point of examining everything slowly, theatrically. The room fell into absolute silence. Jose felt his heart pounding in his chest. That bet had gone too far, and the next step could change everything. While Eduardo Ribeiro pretended to analyze the documents, Jose Batista felt his mind drift away from that icy hall. The noise of the bank grew distant, muffled, as if someone had closed an invisible door. It took only a second for memory to pull him backward, to a time when everything was just land, sun, and stubborn persistence. Before wealth, before the millionaire label that now served as mockery, before any public humiliation. Jose saw himself young again, waking up before daylight. The smell of strong coffee mixed with damp earth still felt real. His hands were already calloused back then, learning early that nothing came easily. There was no glamour, no audience, just work, silence, and hope. His father always said the land gave back what it received. If you cared for it, it would sustain you. If you neglected it, it would charge you. Jose carried that lesson through life. Every fence he built, every lost harvest, every debt he took on was a silent gamble. No one applauded, no one saw. The bank was part of those memories. Years earlier, Jose had walked in the same way, simple, hat in hand, honest request. He needed a loan to expand a farm. Eduardo wasn't a manager yet, but prejudice already lived in that place. They told him farmland wasn't sufficient collateral. Jose remembered that day with painful clarity. The knot in his stomach, the forced smile from the clerk, the refusal wrapped in polite words. It wasn't a lack of paperwork, it was prejudice. He left the bank carrying the weight of humiliation, but also a quiet anger, the kind that turns into fuel. At home, he found strength. Maria, his wife, always knew when something was wrong. He didn't need to say much. His way of sitting, the longer silence, was enough. She listened, held his hand, and reminded him that dignity didn't depend on anyone's approval. Maria believed in Jose when no one else did. She said true wealth came from character and daily effort, that one day everything would bear fruit, but he didn't need to change who he was to prove anything. That voice still lived inside him. Jose remembered the sleepless nights, doing calculations on old paper, the hard years, the lost crops, the bets that almost failed. Every stumble came with other people's judgment. There was always someone saying he was dreaming too big. But he kept going, one step at a time. No showing off, no rushing. Wealth arrived slowly, almost shyly. It grew alongside the farm, the workers, the responsibility. Jose never felt different because of it. Back in the bank, Eduardo cleared his throat, pulling Jose back to the present. The sound was dry, cutting. That entire past seemed invisible there. Nothing Jose had built fit into the cold reading the manager made of him. Prejudice erased decades of struggle. Eduardo commented on incompatible amounts, using that patronizing tone. To Jose, it echoed everything he had heard before. The humiliation now felt like déjà vu, only this time there were more people watching. Jose felt the weight of the bet made minutes earlier. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about showing that appearance doesn't define a story. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding but steady. Soft chuckles rose again around the room. Mockery came easily to those who had never needed to prove anything. Jose looked around and realized how many people must have walked out of that place carrying the same bitter taste. He wasn't alone in that humiliation. The memory of Maria returned with force. She always said not to lower his head when injustice appeared, that standing up was also a way of honoring who you are. Jose pressed his lips together, feeling the decision form inside him. Eduardo lifted his eyes from the papers, preparing to say something final. The entire room seemed suspended in that moment. Jose felt his whole past about to collide with the present, and that collision would not be silent. Eduardo Ribeiro cleared his throat again, as if preparing to deliver the final word. His tone was already loaded with impatience, the kind that doesn't hide the pleasure of giving orders. Jose Batista sensed immediately that the conversation was about to go downhill. The entire bank seemed alert, waiting for the next blow, and humiliation still hung in the air. The manager said Jose needed to present more documents. He spoke of internal rules, procedures, and security, everything delivered in a tone that blended mockery with authority. It wasn't a request, it was an imposition. Jose felt his blood boil, but he kept his composure. When Jose asked for just 50,000 reais, the amount was treated like a joke. Eduardo let out a short laugh and commented that it sounded like a poorly told story. The word millionaire came up again, always wrapped in sarcasm. Jose's wealth remained invisible, erased by his simple appearance. Some customers shook their heads, others laughed awkwardly. The humiliation grew heavier, almost suffocating. Jose felt the urge to leave rising, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from always having to prove who he was. For a moment, he considered giving up. He thought maybe it would be easier to walk away and deal with it later. His chest tightened, his body urging him to escape. That was when the memory of Maria returned with force, almost as if she were standing beside him. Maria always said that identity is not negotiable, that money doesn't define worth, how you walk through life does. She spoke gently but with firmness. That voice still echoed inside Jose, as clear as if it were now. Jose remembered her telling him never to dress up as someone he wasn't just to please others, that wealth didn't need to make noise, that dignity was a quiet thing. That memory gave him strength. Eduardo broke the silence, demanding more paperwork, more explanations. His tone was no longer just mocking, it was accusatory. He suggested that something there wasn't right. Prejudice was now wearing the face of official suspicion. Jose felt the weight of everyone's gaze, some curious, others distrustful. Humiliation now came paired with collective judgment. It felt as though he had to defend himself against something he had never done. Even so, Jose lifted his head. The memory of Maria steadied his steps. He decided he would not leave there in shame. If he was going to leave, it would be with the truth laid bare. In a calm voice, he asked to call his lawyer. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene, he simply stated his right. The room reacted with surprise. Mockery gave way to an uncomfortable silence. Eduardo laughed in disbelief. He commented that this would only make things worse. He mentioned the police, fraud, unnecessary trouble. Every word tried to push Jose back into a position of inferiority. Jose listened without interrupting. Inside, his heart pounded, but the decision had already been made. He wasn't backing down, not after everything he had lived through. Some customers began whispering differently now. It was no longer just laughter. There was curiosity, doubt, even a bit of discomfort. The humiliation was starting to trouble those who were watching. As Jose dialed his lawyer's number, Eduardo crossed his arms, far too confident. He still believed he had control of the situation. He had no idea that call was about to turn the tables and that prejudice was about to meet resistance. Eduardo Ribeiro did not like the idea of a lawyer at all. His smile vanished for a moment, then returned, harder, colder. It was the reaction of someone who felt challenged. He straightened his posture and made a point of speaking even louder. Once again, the entire bank became an audience. In a tone heavy with irony, Eduardo said that Jose Batista was complicating something simple. He remarked that it all looked like an act, something done by someone seeking attention. The humiliation took on a new weight. more aggressive. It was no longer just mockery, it was a direct attack. Eduardo dropped the word fraud like a bait. He said the bank needed to protect itself. He glanced around, searching for support in the curious gazes. Prejudice now came packaged as professional diligence. Jose felt a chill run down his spine. Being treated as a suspect hurt more than the laughter. His dignity was being questioned in front of strangers. Still, he kept his composure. He knew losing his temper was exactly what Eduardo wanted. Some customers began to murmur. A few stepped back, as if Jose were contagious. Others pulled out their phones without any hesitation. Humiliation was turning into content. Mockery was earning likes before it even reached social media. Eduardo then threatened to call the police. He spoke as if the outcome were already certain. He said this wouldn't end cheaply. The word millionaire surfaced again, now as provocation. If he really were one, he wouldn't be like this. Jose took a deep breath. He thought of everything he had built, of every cent earned through sweat. The accusation hurt, but it also awakened something old inside him, the determination not to let this pass. He explained once more that he had held an account there for decades, that he had always honored his commitments. Eduardo pretended to listen, but he had already decided the role Jose would play in that story. Prejudice spoke louder than any truth. A security guard approached discreetly. His presence made everything heavier. Jose realized the humiliation was escalating. It was no longer just embarrassment, it was a threat. At that moment, Jose's phone vibrated. It was his lawyer returning the call. That small vibration felt like a sign of hope. He answered calmly, explaining the situation in a few words. Eduardo rolled his eyes, mocking the conversation. He remarked that no lawyer was going to change the bank's rules. He spoke with contempt, like someone who believed himself untouchable. His confidence bordered on arrogance. As Jose spoke on the phone, more phones appeared, pointed in his direction. Some people were already commenting that something wasn't right. Others were still laughing. Humiliation was beginning to split the audience. Eduardo made a point of repeating that everything was being recorded. He thought that protected him. He didn't realize that every word he spoke was evidence. The mockery was being documented. Jose ended the call and put his phone away carefully. The lawyer was on his way. He lifted his gaze, steady despite the fatigue. This wasn't over yet. Eduardo crossed his arms once more, overly confident. He believed he had turned Jose into the defendant in front of everyone. He didn't know that his own behavior was digging a hole, and that this public humiliation was about to change sides. The bank no longer felt like just a bank. It had turned into a stage. Every gesture by Eduardo Ribeiro, every sharp word was being recorded. The raised cell phones made it clear that the humiliation had gone beyond the glass walls. Jose Batista could feel it in the air. This wasn't going to end there. One customer whispered something about posting the video. Another said it was going to cause trouble. Mockery began to lose its strength, giving way to a strange atmosphere of expectation. Jose realized the game was changing, even though no one announced it. Eduardo tried to regain control. He spoke louder, demanded order, insisted on respect. But his tone no longer intimidated the way it had before. Prejudice, when exposed, loses its mask, and he was starting to look uncomfortable. Jose remained silent, observing. He no longer needed to explain himself. Every word Eduardo spoke seemed to work against him. The humiliation was being broadcast in real time, and that stripped away the confidence of someone who thought himself untouchable. A woman commented, without lowering her voice much, that it was an exaggeration. A man agreed. Small signs of change began to appear. Mockery was no longer unanimous. Eduardo noticed the whispers and tried to defend himself. He said he was just following protocol, that a bank wasn't a place for improvisation. But the more he spoke, the harsher he sounded. Prejudice doesn't pair well with justification. Jose thought about how many times he had seen similar stories. Simple people treated like suspects, wealth measured by clothing. This wasn't just about him, and maybe that was why so many people were recording. The videos began to circulate right there. Notifications popped up on phones. Comments appeared before the scene was even over. Humiliation was gaining reach, and mockery was starting to turn into accusation. Eduardo sensed the shift in the room. His posture stiffened, his smile disappeared for good. Control was slipping through the cracks. Prejudice, when exposed, tends to shrink. Jose felt a mix of shame and relief. He didn't want that exposure, but he knew it was necessary. Sometimes the truth needs to be seen to hurt, and perhaps to heal. An older customer remarked that this was no way to treat anyone. The sentence landed heavily in the room. Silence returned, but different now. A silence of reversed judgment. Eduardo tried to end the situation, saying the service was suspended, but it was too late. The cameras kept rolling. The humiliation had escaped his control. Jose thought of Maria. She used to say that the truth always finds a way, even if it takes time, even if it hurts. He felt that truth there, in the middle of that contained chaos. The security guard took a step back, uncertain. He no longer knew who was right. Eduardo's authority was beginning to crack. Prejudice no longer held up the narrative. Outside, the world was starting to watch. Inside the bank, no one knew it yet, but that scene was far from over. Humiliation had become evidence, and the next chapter would be even harder to control. As the bank buzzed with whispers and tense glances, Jose Batista slowly slipped his hand into the pocket of his shirt. The gesture seemed simple, almost casual, but it carried weight. Inside, carefully folded, was an old card, a small piece of paper he never imagined he would need to use this way. The name printed on it came rushing back to him with force: Augusto Moreira, regional director of the bank. Jose remembered exactly where he knew him from. It wasn't in an air-conditioned office or an elegant meeting. It was at a cattle auction years earlier, under sun and dust. That day, Augusto had been lost, clearly out of place in that environment. Jose had helped him without a second thought. He explained bids, introduced him to people, kept him from making a bad deal. He asked for nothing in return. He simply did what he believed was right. After the auction, Augusto thanked him, shook his hand firmly, and handed him the card. He said that if Jose ever needed anything, he should call. Jose kept it without expectation. He never liked using someone else's name as a shortcut. He preferred things to come through hard work. Now, in the middle of that humiliation, the card felt heavier than paper. It wasn't pride that hurt, it was the sense that perhaps this prejudice would only be heard if it came from above. His wealth did not speak for itself in that place. Eduardo Ribeiro continued pacing back and forth, visibly unsettled. He spoke with the security guard, whispered to a teller. He tried to maintain the appearance of control, but his tone was no longer the same. Jose felt his phone vibrate again. It was the lawyer saying he was arriving. That gave him a bit more ground to stand on. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart steadier. Still, he knew he needed to go further. He took the card out of his pocket and looked at it again. The letters were still clear despite the time. Augusto Moreira, Regional Director. Jose wondered whether Maria would approve. He remembered her saying that asking for help wasn't weakness when injustice was great. Some customers noticed the gesture. The murmuring shifted in tone. It was no longer just curiosity, it was expectation. Something was being set in motion. Eduardo noticed the movement and frowned. He asked with irony whether Jose was calling another imaginary friend. The mockery returned, but it was weak now, without the same force as before. Jose didn't respond. He simply dialed the number calmly. Each ring echoed inside him. There was no anger in that gesture. There was necessity. When the call was answered, Jose identified himself plainly. On the other end, there was silence for a second, then a clear change in tone. Augusto remembered him well. Jose explained the situation in a few words. No exaggeration, no drama. He spoke of humiliation, prejudice, mockery. He spoke of the bet, the accusation. The truth didn't need decoration. Eduardo watched from a distance, uneasy. Something in his expression shifted. Perhaps he realized that the call was not a bluff. His confidence finally began to crack. Jose ended the call and put the card away again. The room fell into absolute silence. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone could feel that the game had changed and that the next round would not favor mockery. Shortly after the call, the atmosphere in the bank shifted for good. It was no longer just curiosity or gossip. It was pure anticipation. Jose Batista stood in silence, leaning against the counter, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that from then on, everything would have to be proven. The lawyer, Dr. Palo, entered the bank with firm steps and an attentive gaze. He didn't need to ask many questions to understand what was happening. The raised cell phones, Eduardo Ribeiro's tense expression, and Jose's weary posture told the whole story. The humiliation was still fresh in the air. Dr. Palo greeted Jose with a discreet nod, the kind that conveys reassurance. Then he asked everyone to remain calm, his voice firm but controlled. That alone was enough to change the tone of the room. Mockery lost its space. Eduardo tried to keep up appearances. He said everything was within regulations. He spoke of procedures, security, internal protocols, but now his words sounded defensive. Prejudice, when questioned, tends to trip over its own justifications. Dr. Palo requested access to the account statements. He spoke of rights, unlawful embarrassment, and public exposure. Each term seemed heavier than the last. Jose swallowed hard, but tried to resist. Jose watched everything in silence. He felt no pleasure in the turning of the tables. He only wanted respect. His wealth had never been a shield. It was always a consequence. And there, at last, it was beginning to show. Meanwhile, a young intern named Marina observed everything from the corner. Her expression showed a familiar discomfort. This was nothing new to her. She had seen similar scenes before. Dr. Palo said that any employee who wished to speak should feel free to do so. The silence that followed was heavy. No one moved at first. Fear still spoke louder. Marina took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. She said it wasn't an isolated case, that Eduardo often treated clients that way, that humiliation was almost routine. A murmur spread through the room. Mockery died completely. Prejudice was beginning to be exposed from the inside out. Eduardo tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Dr. Palo asks that everything be documented, videos, testimonies, documents. The truth now had shape, names, and evidence. It was no longer one word against another. Eduardo lost his composure. His voice rose, his face flushed. He tried to discredit Marina, to insinuate ulterior motives, but that only made things worse. Control slipped away entirely. Jose felt a tightness in his chest, not for himself, but for all those who had gone through that in silence. His wealth had protected him in the end, but how many others hadn't had the same chance? Dr. Palo announced that the case would move forward. He spoke of a formal meeting, an internal audit, accountability. The words sounded final. For the first time, Eduardo fell silent. The bank seemed suspended in time. Humiliation was being reorganized into evidence, and that story, which began with mockery, was now moving toward a greater confrontation, one that no one there would be able to avoid. The meeting was scheduled urgently. A large room, a long table, heavy air. Jose Batista walked in the same way he had entered the bank, simple, calm, without drawing attention. But now, no one laughed. The mockery had been left outside. The managers arrived one by one, exchanging tense glances. Eduardo Ribeiro was among them, visibly different. He no longer carried the puffed-up chest from before. The prejudice he once used as a shield now weighed on his shoulders. Dr. Paulo carefully arranged the documents, bank statements, tax returns, asset records. Everything clear, everything official. The truth didn't need to shout, it only needed to be shown. When the numbers appeared on the screen, the silence was absolute. It wasn't a small amount. It wasn't an exaggeration. Jose's assets exceeded 20 million. The word millionaire, once used as mockery, now sounded like fact. Jose watched the faces around the table. Some were surprised, others embarrassed. His wealth was not accompanied by arrogance, only by work accumulated over decades. One of the managers cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. He asked if there might be a mistake. Dr. Paulo calmly replied that everything was documented, audited, registered. There was no room for doubt. Eduardo tried to justify himself. He said that he had followed protocol, that suspicion was part of the job. But then the recordings were played. The tone, the mockery, the humiliation, everything was there. Marina was called again. This time, she spoke with more confidence. She confirmed that the behavior was recurring. That prejudice targeted not only appearance, but origin, way of speaking, clothing. The regional director, Augustus Moreira, had followed everything in silence. His serious expression revealed disappointment. He remembered Jose well, the man who had helped without asking for anything. That made everything even more serious. When Augusto finally spoke, the room seemed to shrink. He said the bank could not condone humiliation or prejudice, that no amount of wealth justified a lack of character. His words were direct. Eduardo tried to argue once more, but was interrupted. The humiliating bet was mentioned, the threat to call the police as well. Each point dismantled his version of events. Jose remained silent. There was no satisfaction on his face, only exhaustion and dignity. He had never wanted to defeat anyone, he only wanted respect. Augusto announced that Eduardo would be suspended immediately. An internal investigation would be opened. The decision fell like dead weight onto the table. Mockery had finally met consequences. Some managers looked away, others nodded in silence. Prejudice in that room had nowhere left to hide. Jose took a deep breath. That room didn't erase the humiliation he had endured, but it showed that truth, when sustained, changes the game. And there was still something important left to be said. The room gradually emptied, as if the air had become too heavy to stay. Jose Batista remained seated for a few seconds, feeling the fatigue in his body. What he felt was not relief. It was a strange mix of justice and weariness. Humiliation doesn't disappear easily, even when the truth comes to light. Augusto Moreira approached him carefully. His tone was unlike anything Jose had heard in that bank. There was no superiority, no excessive formality. There was respect. And that, more than any amount of money, touched him deeply. Augusto apologized on behalf of the institution. He said the bank had failed. That prejudice, when not confronted, grows roots. Jose listened in silence, absorbing every word. It wasn't about revenge, it was about acknowledgement. Eduardo Ribeiro was escorted out of the room without looking back. The man who once mocked now avoided all eye contact. The wealth he believed he represented did not protect him. No bank can manufacture character. Jose stood up slowly, adjusting his simple shirt. The same clothes that had caused laughter now provoked nothing but embarrassment in others. He noticed how quickly judgment changes when power shifts sides. Dr. Paulo mentioned that the case would still have legal consequences: compensation, lawsuits, public apologies. Jose nodded, but his gaze was distant. Formal justice mattered, but it didn't erase what had been lived. As he left the bank, Jose felt the sun hit his face. The air outside felt lighter. Some people who had witnessed the scene earlier looked away. Others lowered their heads. Mockery had turned into silence. He thought about how often appearance decides someone's fate. How many doors close before the first word is even spoken. Wealth, when not accompanied by empathy, becomes nothing more than a cruel filter. Jose remembered his father, the land, hands dirty with clay. He remembered Maria, her firm voice telling him never to be ashamed of who he was. That victory wasn't about money, it was about remaining whole. His phone vibrated with messages, videos, comments. The story was spreading across the country. Many people saw themselves in it. Others felt uncomfortable. When prejudice is exposed, it doesn't choose who it affects. Jose turned off the phone and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't want to become a symbol or a hero. He just wanted no one else to go through what he did. But he knew that story wasn't his alone. Before getting into the car, he looked one last time at the bank building. It seemed smaller now, less imposing. Institutions are only great when the people inside them are. Jose started the engine calmly. His heart was still racing, but there was peace. Not because he had defeated someone, but because he hadn't bowed. Humiliation tried to break him. It failed. As he drove, he thought about how many people confuse wealth with appearance, power with respect, and pay dearly for it. Life collects its debts sooner or later. That story ended there, but it left a question hanging in the air. How many times has someone been judged solely by what they seemed to be? And how many truths are still waiting for the courage to surface? The story of Jose Batista isn't just about a bank, a manager, or a bad day. It's about how often the world decides who you are before it even listens to you. It's about how prejudice grows comfortable when it believes no one will confront it, and about how humiliation, when swallowed in silence, builds up inside. Jose could have walked away. He could have lowered his head, as so many do to avoid pain. But he stayed, not to prove he was a millionaire, but to show that dignity isn't measured by clothes, an address, or appearance. His wealth had always been there, in honest work, in firm character, in the courage to not reshape himself to please those who judge. This story forces us to look inward. How many times do we judge too quickly? How often do we confuse simplicity with weakness, or power with human worth? Not all prejudice is loud. Sometimes it just laughs. Sometimes it just mocks until the day it meets someone who chooses not to stay silent. May this story serve as a mirror, not an accusation, as a warning, not an attack. Because in the end, the truth always emerges. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It simply stands there, steady, impossible to ignore.